Hello, welcome back to Too Fond of Books. My name is Janelle and this is another March Mystery Madness video. In this video, I am going to be letting you know about all the books that I've read in this fourth week of March. And I will update you on my bingo card. Now, this isn't the wrap-up because there are still a few days left in March, and so March 31st, I'll post a video with a wrap-up, give you the final all the final stats and my thoughts on March Mystery Madness. But for this video, we'll just be talking about the books that I read this week. Now, before we get into all of that, I need to give you the answer to yesterday's My March Mystery Madness Mindbender. The clue was, it was just her luck to be paired with the 8th Earl of Asherton. What did Barbara Havers call him when they were on the job? And the answer is D.I. Linley. I love this series by Elizabeth George. D.I. Linley is the 8th Earl of Asherton, but he chooses to be a police officer in London. And his sergeant, Barbara Havers, is fantastic. She is definitely working class, and at first is just totally not into having to work for a guy who is also an earl. And so their relationship in this series is awesome. It's so good. And this series has also been made into a TV show on B.C. or something. But yeah, it's a great show. So if you ever get a chance to see those, they're called the D.I. Linley Mysteries, I think. This is the first one in the series called A Great Deliverance, and I just checked this. I didn't realize that it was written so long ago. I thought the series started in the 90s, but this is actually from 1988. And I believe she's still writing in this series. It's really good. So if you've never read any of the D.I. Linley series, definitely check it out. It's a really good one. Now, let's get on to the books that I have read this week. I showed you Sacrifice last week that I had started on the Saturday, and I talked about the page of text that was from the wrong book. Anyway, that didn't happen again, thank goodness. And so I got through this one, and it was really good. This was a reread for me. I gave it 4 stars. I love Sharon Bolton. She's one of my favorite authors. And so this was a great one. This was set on the Shetland Islands, which I find very interesting as a setting. And this woman and her husband moved back up there. She's an obstetrician, and her husband actually grew up on the Shetland Islands. And so they moved back up there, and she one day is out digging a grave for a horse. She has a couple horses that she just loves, and one of them has died, and she's digging a grave for her horse and discovers a body in the peat. And the story goes on from there, and I quite enjoyed it. It was really good. It was possibly a bit silly at times, but I enjoyed it. I was totally along for the ride, and so I gave it 4 stars. Then I read The Calling of the Grave by Simon Beckett. This is the 4th book in his series, in his David Hunter series. I love this series. I think David Hunter is a great character, and Simon Beckett writes fantastic stories. So David Hunter is a forensic anthropologist. So think Bones, Temperance Brennan, but in the UK. And these books are just, they're so good. Now this one, of the 4 that I've read, wasn't my favorite. He didn't do quite as much of his work in this book, which is what I find so interesting. But it was still really good. I still gave it 4 stars. So in this book, it actually starts 8 years earlier, which is very interesting because in this series, in the first book, you find out very early on, so this is not a spoiler or anything, that his wife and daughter were killed in a car accident. And in the first book, he has quit his job as a forensic anthropologist and moved to some small town where he becomes just a general GP. And in order to try and, I mean, he's grieving. And so in this book, it goes to the past 8 years earlier where his wife and still daughter are still alive. So that was actually a really interesting part, to see him interact with his wife and with his daughter. So 8 years ago, they found the body buried on the moor. They were certain that this was one of psychotic rapist and multiple murderer Jerome Monk's teenage victims, which just left 2 more bodies to find. But the ill-conceived search ended badly, and with Monk safely behind bars, the momentum faltered. For forensics expert David Hunter and those others who were part of the recovery team, life moved on, and the dead were left undisturbed. Now, though, a nightmare scenario unfurls. Monk has escaped and seems to be targeting anyone involved in that original ill-fated operation. Lured back to the moors by a desperate call for help, Hunter begins to realize that neither the events unfolding now nor those of 8 years ago were quite what they seem, and as the maniac's violent trail edges ever closer, the past is suddenly anything but dead and buried. So yeah, it was pretty good. Not my favorite of the series, like I said, but I still really enjoyed it. And this one fulfilled the prompt. This one did not fulfill any prompts. I just enjoyed it. It was one of my library books that I had out, and I just felt like reading it. And it's a mystery, so even though it doesn't fulfill a prompt, it still totally counts for March Mystery Madness. I should go back and let you know, Sacrifice fulfilled the prompt of a page count divisible by 5 because it had, hang on, 375 pages. So, one thing that I found very interesting, I read this one, and a lot of the action takes place in Dartmoor, on the moor, and they encounter abandoned tin mines, and that plays a part in the story. And so I thought that was very interesting. But then I picked up Bernard Knight's The Tinner's Corpse, which is also set in Devon, and involves tin mines, which I thought was bizarre. That was totally not intentional at all. Now this one is set in 1194, so this is before they even started mining in the ground for the tin, and that was a really interesting part of this book. So let me explain what this is. This is the 5th in the series of the Crowner John mysteries, so that was the prompt that I read this one for. He is the coroner. He is assigned the coroner for Devon, and it's his job to have inquests and to look into the cause of death and making sure that the body's been identified. Very much like what a coroner still does, I believe. He also has a few other responsibilities, but in this book, when Crowner John is summoned to the bleak Devonshire moors to investigate the murder of a tin miner, he has little idea how difficult this new investigation would prove to be. The victim worked for Devon's most powerful and successful mine owner, Walter Knapman. There seems to be only one possible motive: to sabotage Walter's business. But the Tinners have their own laws, and they are none too pleased at Crowner John's interference. And then Walter Knapman disappears. A decapitated body, a missing tinner, a disgruntled band of miners, and a mad Saxon intent on destroying all things Norman. How on earth can Crowner John sort all this out when his wife hates him, his mistress has spurned him for a younger man, and his clerk is in the grip of a suicidal depression? Only Gwyn, I think that's how you say it, Gwyn, Crowner John's indispensable right-hand man, seems to be of any help at all, until he is arrested for murder and put on trial for his life. I really enjoy this series. Bernard Knight writes historical mystery in a way that is very accessible to the reader. It is a time period that I am very unfamiliar with. Life is so very different back then, but he writes it in such a way that I can imagine what's going on and easily follow the story. He has a great author's note at the very beginning that says he sometimes gets things like emails or whatever from his readers saying, why aren't you writing this in the proper language of the time? And he says, well, that's because they speak early early Middle English. Early Middle English, is that what it's called? Let me just go to it. Oh yes. As with previous Crowner John mysteries, it should be pointed out that any attempt to give dialogue an old world flavor, and he writes it with the E's on the end, which is hilarious, would be as inaccurate as it would be futile. In the time and place of this story, most people would have spoken early Middle English, unintelligible to us today. Others spoke Western Welsh, later called Cornish, and the ruling classes used Norman French amongst themselves. The language of the church and almost everything written was Latin. So he is a very good excuse for just writing it in regular English that we can understand. But I really enjoyed this book. I found all the attention given to Crowner John's relationship with his wife and with his various mistresses was a little bit annoying. I'm not a fan of, adultery and all of that stuff. But I understand that it's the time period and maybe that was accepted behavior. I don't know. Sometimes it felt like there was a bit too much of all of that. But there was this great scene towards the end that just, I loved it. I love when justice is served. I love when you've got a character who is just, he finds justice and following the law to be vital and of such importance. And there's this great scene where he finds out about an inquest that should not be held. The man who is holding it hasn't actually even been officially declared a coroner. And there's just so much wrong about how this inquest is being is proceeding. And so I just loved this series. Basically, Crowner John bursts into the inquest and just roars his anger at the injustice. So here's just a part of it. De Wolf's, that's his last name, De Wolf's patience snapped, worn to breaking point by rising incredulity and anger. He thrust his way across the floor below the dais to stand in front of Gwyn and glare at the new coroner. The platform was only knee-high, and as Fitz-Ivo was sitting down, De Wolf's face was on level with his. "Have you gone mad, old fool, or are you just drunk?" he yelled in a voice so strident that a hush fell upon the hall, even among the more raucous elements who had just been applauding his officer's death sentence. Fitz-Ivo flinched, his protuberant, watery eyes gazing at De Wolf as if he was the devil just arrived from hell. He opened his mouth to protest, but John overrode his words. "Have you learned nothing about your duties and powers, man?" he ranted. "A coroner cannot pass any sentence, let alone that of death. If your jury names a person as being responsible, then he must be committed to the king's justices for trial." And this goes on for a few more pages of awesomeness. And once he has gotten control of the proceedings, the last paragraph of the scene is this. As the Cornish man, grinning with relief, shuffled toward the door, De Wolf beckoned to the front row of the sullen but subdued audience. "Those of you who were named as the jury, come forward and look closely at the corpse." And then he just goes right back into following the law and doing a proper inquest. I loved that scene. It was so good, and I'm so glad it was in there because I actually found the very end of this book a bit unsatisfactory to how I like mysteries to be resolved. And so I only gave this particular one 3.5 stars. I still love this series, but I was a little bit unsatisfied with the ending. So having that scene in there really helped. I also read The A.B.C. Murders by Agatha Christie. And I've already fulfilled this prompt, but just to make it fit for March Mystery Madness, it has 5 words in the title. This is just the continuation in my reading of Agatha Christie. I'm reading them in publication order, and I mean, you already know this if you've been watching my channel. I love Agatha Christie. She's my favorite author, and the A.B.C. Murders was great. I gave this one 4.5 stars. and I loved it. So in this one, Poirot is up against a series of murders in which the killer is sending Poirot letters in the mail. And yeah, this one is quite good. One thing I found very interesting, this was published in 1935, and Poirot is having a discussion with Hastings. Hastings is back from Argentina for a bit to narrate this story. And he says, they're having a discussion about types of crimes, and Poirot says, "Supposing," murmured Poirot, "that 4 people sit down to play bridge, and one, the odd man out, sits in a chair by the fire. At the end of the evening, the man by the fire is found dead. One of the 4, while he is dummy, has gone over and killed him, and intent on the play of the hand, the other 3 have not noticed. Ah, there would be a crime for you. Which of the 4 was it?" And I thought that was hilarious, because that is exactly the plot of Cards on the Table, which is a Poirot story that comes up, I think it's like 2 or 3 books after this one, in the same year, or 1936. And so she probably already had the idea in her head to write that book, but I love that she included that in here. So I'm going to be watching during Cards on the Table to see if Poirot makes any comment about the fact that he imagined this exact murder earlier with Hastings. And then finally I read Mary Stewart's This Rough Magic, and this was for the prompt of a place that has 5 letters, and this is set in Corfu, so it was perfect. This is her book from 1964, and the main character, Lucy Waring, is an actress in London, and she's kind of trying to break in to the business, as they say, and she was in a play on the West End, and she was so excited to get the part, but the play folds after a couple of months, and so she decides to go and visit her sister, who is living on Corfu. Her sister is pregnant and kind of alone. Her husband has to go work in Athens, I think, and so Lucy goes to visit her sister in Corfu, and discovers some happenings going on. And so the twin, or the brother of one of the girls who works for her sister, is drowned. They don't have a body, but they know that he has to be dead, and they're not sure if they would ever find the body. So that's upsetting. And Lucy is meeting people in the area, and then another man is found dead, drowned. Lucy is actually the one who finds him, and so she's starting to wonder just what's going on in this area. And this was great. I really enjoyed it. For being from 1964, it's held up very well. There is a big part of this book that definitely places it in 1964, and that's that the Corfu is not all that far from Albania, which at the time was communist. And so they talk about communism, they talk about the Iron Curtain and smuggling things into Albania, which I found all very interesting. Yeah, so I really enjoyed this book, and I'll definitely be reading more from Mary Stewart. I quite enjoyed her writing style, and yeah, I gave it 4 stars. So here's the update on my March Mystery Madness bingo card. Can you see here? I only have 2 squares left, and I have 3 days. So I am fairly confident that I can read those 2 books and fill those squares and get a blackout on my bingo card. So what have you been reading this last week of March for March Mystery Madness? I'd love to hear about it down in the comment section down below. Have you read any of these books? What did you think about them? And before I say goodbye, I need to give you the next My March Mystery Madness Mindbender. This 19th century Canadian detective uses science to solve mysteries. Put your guess in the comment section down below. Put your answer if you know definitely for sure who this is. Put it in the comment section down below, and I will see you again tomorrow for another March Mystery Madness video. Bye!